Hashtag the anointed ones. Welcome. History remembers when the audience yelled, not when they were quiet. You endured storms for years that no one acknowledged were occurring. As if your suffering were an optical illusion, you were deceived in the middle of the day as everyone else turned their heads away. Let me tell you something frightening, though. More than 70% of whistleblowers experience punishment for speaking the truth too soon rather than for lying. Does it sound familiar? You were ahead of your time, not insane. You were just too correct for a society that was dependent on denial. You weren't too loud. The throng that abandoned you during your crucifixion is now returning with megaphones. The quiet has broken. The dam has broken. And today, not only at your side, but because of you, the people who once questioned you are marching. It's poetry, let's face it. The same people who used to ignore your calls for justice are suddenly behaving as if they always knew what you were saying and citing it as gospel. Adorable, huh? However, this isn't about public approval or small-time retaliation. The heavenly response to years of spiritual gaslighting is the subject of this discussion. During this time of year, heaven says, enough. So, chosen one, fasten your seatbelt because we will no longer be whispering in this episode. You began the celebration in quiet, and now the throng is rising, loud, proud, and very late. Let's get started. Hashtag one. At last, they realized that you were never the bad guy, just the mirror that unnerved them. People like discussing truth until the truth enters the room in human form. And you were just that, not the enemy, not a danger, and not a problem. Simply put, they weren't prepared to see through you. You didn't need to speak at all. You were the mirror from which they were unable to escape just by being you, by being with integrity, depth, and self-awareness. Their ego-driven decisions, fear, faux friendliness, envy, and dishonesty were all mirrored back to you. And they blamed the mirror rather than confronting what they saw. Their labels of too much, too sensitive, too intense, or too dramatic were applied because your presence felt too tight, not because you were. Something old in them was awakened by you, the truth they had been avoiding. By just walking with purpose, you exposed spiritual indolence. By refusing to submit to manipulation, you revealed it. And since it was simpler than changing, they supported the myth that you were the issue for a long time. However, time has a way of revealing what gaslighting and flattery attempted to conceal. The same audience that previously thought you were a disturbance is now acknowledging that you were a divine disruption. You weren't sent to cause turmoil, but to awaken people. They're also awakening. People are starting to say things like, I didn't understand it then, but I see it now, or they were right all along, one by one. It's about people realizing how they took part in your crucifixion because they were unable to confront themselves, not simply about you being vindicated. It's about recognizing the damage they did by turning away from what was supposed to be a growth-promoting experience. And for that reason, they're rising up now. Not only to protect you, but to face themselves. Not because you changed, but because they did, everything you stood for is now being recognized. And even if they may never completely comprehend the burden you bore or the self-control required to put up with their misinterpretation, one thing is for sure now. They no longer see you as the bad guy. They see you as the mirror they smashed in the past, but now desperately need. Hashtag 2. The same individuals who looked on in silence are now plagued by their lack of action. They saw your situation. They didn't say anything, maybe not every detail, but enough to know it was wrong, to feel the unfairness, to have that gut feeling that screamed, this isn't right. Comfort was more important to them than bravery. Unaware that their silence constituted a type of engagement in and of itself, they decided not to become engaged. And that quiet is now resonating more loudly than any falsehood that has ever been said about you. They believed they were preserving their tranquility. In reality, they served to preserve the facade of morality that let cruelty to thrive unchallenged. They told themselves it was none of their concern while you were being deceived, slandered, ostracized, or broken down. However, time has now made everything clear. They have since transformed that same quiet into regret. You see, there's always a cost to quiet. And for them, the cost is due in the shape of painful memories and restless thoughts. They recall the glances you exchanged and the silent pleas for assistance. They recall times when they had the opportunity to speak out, stand up for you, or reach out, but they choose not to. And now that they know who you really were, not the bad guy, not the issue, the one who was keeping things together while being ripped apart. The guilt of that strikes in a new way. They are tormented because you did not fail, not because you failed, because you still rose, because you recovered in front of the same people who turned their backs on you. Since you're still standing, not as a victim, but as a quiet storm that demonstrated that the truth can endure without an audience, they are now seeking to put things right. Some will raise their voices. Some will publicly support you. People who are too embarrassed to acknowledge how badly they have let you down will do it in silence. However, they are aware that their quiet cost them something. They failed a test of allegiance, honesty, and basic humanity, and they did more than simply watch you suffer. And they will bear the consequences of it for a lot longer than any rumor ever did. #3. Their wake-up call, not your defeat, but your isolation. They believed that you would be broken if they left you alone, that you would ultimately fall apart if you withdrew, remained quiet, or pretended you didn't exist. They thought you were weak because you were alone. However, they failed to see that isolation is where chosen ones are polished, not ruined. You were realigning as they waited for your demise. You were letting go of previous incarnations of yourself, purging yourself of their projections, and re-establishing contact with your innermost self. The stillness was awful at first. Everything was questioned by you. You questioned if you were insane, whether you had done anything wrong, and whether you may have earned it. The emotional sabotage had dug that deep. However, something significant began to change. You drew closer to the truth the further they moved away. You understood that their absence was protection rather than punishment. It made room for you to think freely, see clearly, and separate from love-based emotional manipulation. The individuals who left you felt as if they were taking something away, but in reality, they were giving you the best present of all, clarity. You could tell who was genuine and who was only surfing the wave of your brightness when there was no noise. You recalled who you were before you were taught to shrink, free from the distractions. And you were subtly laying the groundwork for a foundation they couldn't topple, no matter how hard they tried. While they saw your silence as surrender, they're beginning to sense it now. People are starting to awaken. They understand that your seclusion exposed them, not destroyed you. It became clear how quickly individuals may give up on things they don't understand. It demonstrated how easily people follow the herd, even when it is incorrect. And since you recovered from a situation from which most people don't, it demonstrated your true strength. You didn't die because of your seclusion. Rather, it let you discover the side of yourself that doesn't need praise, affirmation, or support. And for the time being, the audience is swelling for that version. Because the stillness that once enveloped you has become unquestionable proof. You made it through what was supposed to shatter you without being resentful or insignificant. Power is that. #4. Although they made fun of you in public, your receipts were divine and well-timed. They let out a big chuckle. They turned your name into a program. They turned your suffering into amusement. Confident that you lacked the authority or standing to defend yourself, they took your tale and ran with it. Knowing that people are more likely to trust the loudest voice rather than the one speaking the truth, they gave their version first. You remained silent, not because you were weak, but because you were receiving spiritual guidance to hold off. There was no need for you to reveal them. Evidence was already being gathered by time. Heaven was recording everything while they were busy acting, recording their falsehoods and fabricating illusions. Every discussion, treachery, and false charge was being stored, not for revenge, but for vindication. It takes time for divine timing to cleanse your identity. It waits until the quiet is unbearable and your absence begins to pose questions that no one can respond to. The receipts are now appearing. Some in the form of tangible evidence, such as texts, screenshots, eyewitness accounts, and whistleblowers. Others take the shape of supernatural disturbances, such as inexplicable changes, unanticipated revelations, or spiritual downloads that strike others who have previously assessed you harshly. No longer is the truth concealed. It's smashing through doors without even knocking. People are startled because you never put up a fight to establish your point, not because you were correct. That's the reason they're rising. They are now supporting you because of this. Without making it public, you carried treachery. You didn't have to clap back after enduring humiliation. And when the truth eventually came to light, it was so obvious and uncannily true that it couldn't have been a coincidence. They were unaware that the quiet was a prelude to a larger plan. There was monitoring in that paradise, that the Most High records everything, not just those who are selected. They were shaken not just by the truth, but also by the precision in its delivery, the timing, the clarity, the manner it struck. It's divine judgment, not retaliation. The audience is now seeing the tables being turned. And for once, they're standing on your side, not simply observing it. Because what was concealed is now clearly seen. And now the revelation they can't unsee is the person they previously made fun of. #5. The public saw who was really hurling the stones. Everyone's eyes were on you for a long time. It was you who was being blamed, criticized, discussed in whispers, and torn apart. They pretended that you were overreacting or that you just couldn't handle criticism. The portion they attempted to hide, however, is finally emerging. The beginning, the part where the assaults began with them waging quiet war under guises of righteousness rather than with you defending yourself. They approached you with a clean smile, praying in front of you, reciting scripture, and using religious terminology as a disguise for their brutality. However, behind closed doors, they were defaming you, excluding you, and causing others to doubt your morality while feigning care. For a time, the audience believed them because they had the proper connections, the appropriate attire, and the right words. But even when buried deep, truth has a peculiar way of rising to the surface. The people who used to stand on the sidelines are now asking the right question. Who started all of this? The same people who pretended to be trying to help are now being exposed as manipulators, instigators, and saboteurs who were hiding behind fake smiles and spiritual language. The fact that the stones were being thrown, but who was throwing them? The folks who usually appeared composed, spoke loudly about humility and grace, and were the first to say, "Let's pray about it," while poisoning others behind your back, was what startled everyone. The masks are coming off now. The audience is now focused on who cast the first shadow rather than who yelled the loudest. The focus now is on responsibility and the facts, not damage management, or let's all just move on. And people are realizing for the first time that you were the target, not the storm. The individuals who flung those stones are now aware that their reputation is at risk in addition to yours, which they have harmed. #6. You spoke quietly, yet your voice was supported by reality. You didn't have to be loud, and you weren't. You weren't out here trying to get attention or persuade others to agree with you. You spoke the truth without drama, in a calm and straightforward manner. Additionally, they believed you had no case since you didn't yell or plead. They believed that being soft-spoken meant you could be ignored, that being silent denoted weakness, and that being tranquil implied guilt. But truth doesn't require loudness. It simply needs time. You let reality do what it does best, which is expose, while they were acting and attempting to change public opinion. You didn't go after others to establish your value. You let the months, the days, the outcomes, and the trends to do the talking. And now, in full daylight, the exact things you forewarned about, the injustices, the betrayals, the spiritual violations, are taking place. Now, everything you predicted is happening, and not in a hazy or symbolic sense. It's accurate. It's particular. There is no denying it. Your remarks are aging like prophecies for those who formerly dismissed you. Those who accused you of being theatrical are now reviewing the time frames, listening to talks again, and seeing that you were disclosing rather than reacting. What was formerly thought to be hyperbole is now seen as foresight. Perception is increasingly being acknowledged as what was before known as paranoia. The audience is changing because the facts have caught up, not because you have changed. Even those who didn't want to accept it are being compelled to change their minds since reality has begun to fit your truth so exactly. The results are obvious and difficult to dispute. Because you yelled louder, you didn't win. Because you were in line with the truth, you prevailed. You allow character to stand up for you rather than chaos. Where influence formerly mattered, you let consistency speak. Even the doubters are now forced to acknowledge that, despite the fact that your voice may have been quiet, it was always appropriate. And the silent one they previously disregarded has turned into the unquestionable evidence that justice is being rendered in real time. #7. Your story was prophetic, not just personal. It first seemed like a lonely, unpleasant, and unjust path. As if life had singled you out for punishment, you couldn't stop wondering, Why me? You had to contend with spiritual assaults that made no sense, loneliness, and betrayal. People you trusted become aloof. The people who called themselves holy misinterpreted you, ignored you, and rejected you. Your narrative wasn't random. It was a preview, a living message, a prophetic blueprint disguised up as pain. You weren't simply surviving. However, you were blazing a trail through spiritual battle that others are just now beginning to follow. That's what you didn't comprehend back then. The same patterns that you experienced, the spiritual manipulation, the faux friendliness, and the abuse of power under the guise of religion, are now occurring to other people. The difference is that they are not blindly navigating it. They recall your tale. They recall your handling of it. They recall how you stood up, told the truth, established limits, and maintained your integrity throughout. People are beginning to realize that you were never alone on your path. In order to save others from being devoured by the fire, you were ordered to go through it first. Like a spiritual scout, you were sent ahead to take the knocks, figure out the traps, and clear the path for others who would follow. Your story now strikes a new chord since it is instructive as well as inspiring. You have survival intel in your narrative. People are going over what you said, your cautions, and your decisions again. They've now realized that you weren't being theatrical. It wasn't your imagination. What they're only now beginning to experience, you were experiencing in real time. All of a sudden, the narrative that previously made them uneasy is now providing them the words to express their own struggles. In reality, what seemed like rejection was providential placement. You were a spiritual pioneer ahead of the curve. And now that you've understood what was supposed to shatter you, the audience is rising not only to cheer you on, but to follow your example. And because you had the courage to share your experience aloud, others are now surviving. #8. They're marching because what was done to you is happening to them. You seem to be the odd one out for a while, the one who was too emotional, too reactive, or too sensitive. You spoke your opinions about topics that other people claimed didn't exist. In places that were meant to be safe, you exposed subtle brutality, control, manipulation, and gaslighting. And you were ignored, branded, and silenced rather than taken seriously. They gave you the impression that you were the problem and that everything was in your head. However, the script has since been reversed. And not because you changed, but rather because the public finally realized the truth. The masks have crumbled in their own lives, and they are experiencing what you have. They're using the same strategies that almost broke you. The same individuals who used compassion as a weapon against you are now manipulating other people. And this time, there will be consequences for the manipulation. Why? Since they now understand how it feels. This is mutual agony, not sympathy. They are rising because they recognize themselves in your experience, not to console you. Hearing about betrayal is one thing, but experiencing it firsthand is quite another. And once people experienced that spiritual hurt for themselves, your speech became much more truthful and far less theatrical. Your narrative turned into a guide and a map. Even while you were being labeled insane, you set the foundation. You demonstrated to them what surviving entails, namely, how to recover without becoming hateful, rather than only talking about it. How to establish limits without feeling guilty. How to maintain your identity while the world is out to destroy it. They get it now. They're marching now. With you, not behind you. Because they no longer just know your name from hearsay. You are live evidence that those who attempted to destroy them need not prevail. Additionally, they are marching because they know in their hearts that you were never insane. You were the first. #9. Your silence was evidence control, not a sign of weakness. They were anticipating your break. They were really counting on it. They hoped you would lose your temper, say something they could misrepresent, and turn against you. The strategy was straightforward. Provoke you just enough to make your response seem to be the issue, while they pretended to be innocent. You didn't fall for it, however. They might have spun an outburst, but you didn't. They had nothing to blame since you didn't offer them a scene. You offered them silence instead. Furthermore, the quiet seemed calculated rather than passive. You opted for observation rather than conflict. You observed. You paid attention. As they undervalued you, you made mental notes. While they were presenting their version of events, you were putting together your case. Not for retribution, but for revelation, by gathering every falsehood, slight, and manipulation like receipts in a folder marked Truth Pending. People mistook your silence for submission, but you were recording, not running away. You remained silent because you recognized the importance of timing, not because you were afraid. You were aware that truth doesn't have to yell when it eventually moves. It simply settles. And the moment has arrived. Now, the mayhem they caused is more loud than anything you have ever uttered. They are being caught in their falsehoods. They're losing their masks. Their inconsistencies are coming to light. On the other hand, your poise is revealing all. They did it to themselves in an attempt to fill the void you left behind. You didn't have to expose anybody. People are listening to you now because of your restraint, not because you asked for it, but because it reflects your true self. Not everyone can sit with the truth long enough to allow it to speak for itself, but anybody can create noise. You did. The loudest testimony in the room has now replaced your silence. Drama was what they desired. You provided them with paperwork. Additionally, the proof is proving their character and clearing your name, which is precisely what it was intended to achieve. ####10. Validation was never necessary for you, but it's coming with thunder. For attention, you didn't reconstruct yourself. To make a point, you didn't heal. You discreetly gathered up your shattered fragments in shadowy nooks where no one ever cared to inspect. You were engaged with the grim, personal task of surviving while others were occupied with observing those who were adept at feigning perfection. You were developing where no one could see, weeping in private, and forgiving in solitude. No kudos, no congrats, just unadulterated, holy progress. Your suffering made no sound, so they were unaware that you were sinking. You did not plead for pity. You didn't exploit your pain as cash or publicize it. You persevered because you had no other option, not because it was simple. And you continued to build, brick by brick, scar by scar, lesson after lesson, even while they ignored you, downplayed you, and even made fun of your quiet. Something changed now. The same individuals who disregarded your decline are now beginning to recognize your ascent. And not because you're yelling, but rather because you're unmistakable. You're growing loudly. You have a bright shine. Now the quiet on you has a sound of its own. And the people who used to ignore your suffering are now pausing to inquire. How did they survive that? The problem is that you're not rising with resentment. You're not searching for long overdue accolades or "I'm sorry" postings. You never needed their approval, and you don't need it now. That's why this moment is so potent. You didn't wait for their blessing. But now that it's approaching loudly, firmly, and respectfully. Once confused individuals are now citing your knowledge. They're talking about your trip. They're staring in wonder because it's hard to ignore how much you've changed, not because you want them to. Your mission came out of the same ashes they rejected. They are now assembling not just to see your homecoming, but also to gain knowledge from it. Not because you yelled, but because you remained grounded, authentic, and let your resurrection to speak for itself. You were indisputable. ###11. They now owe you respect since your suffering served as their playbook. People looked on as your life was crumbling apart. Others did it out of silent intrigue, others out of judgment, and some out of curiosity. The drama, the heartache, the mess, you were their quiet amusement. They saw you lose your peace of mind, relationships, and possibilities. And many leaned back and examined you like a case study rather than offering assistance. Their goal was to see whether you would break down, go insane, lash out, or disappear. Unexpectedly, however, you climbed back up, not with a spectacular comeback or overnight miracle, but with little, unwavering steps that created something tangible. In front of those who wanted to see your failure become permanent, you recovered. When no one else did, you stood up for yourself. As you stood up, they took notes with their eyes wide open, but in a discreet manner. They saw how you set boundaries in response to betrayal, rebuilt without seeking retribution, and transformed your wounds into knowledge. They refused to acknowledge that they learned more from your suffering than from any self-help book. They began to speak in your words, imitate your way of thinking, and follow the trails you blazed. They saw your blueprint, not only the highlight reel, but the genuine, unvarnished, backstage structure that included loneliness, sweat, and restless nights. They're now using what they've learned from observing you in their daily lives. Some even used the exact knowledge they derided to achieve success while it was still cloaked in your suffering. They took inspiration from your struggle rather than just observing it. Like silent pupils at a school they never admitted to, they downloaded your survival skills. And they realized deep down that they owe you respect, whether they express it out or not. They have your fingerprints all over their evolution, not because you're demanding it. You were establishing a standard, not just getting by. The least they can do now that they're prospering on the foundation you created in silence is to pay tribute to the person they studied in secret while feigning blindness. Hashtag 12. They attempted to bury you like a seed, but you ended up becoming the root that held the ground. When they cut you off, soiled your name, and shut every door they could force shut in your face, they believed they had put an end to you. They thought your narrative would finish there. They saw seclusion as breakdown and quiet as capitulation. They were unaware that you were growing underground, in areas they couldn't see, rather than vanishing. You were softly, thoroughly, and forcefully taking root. You were changing under the surface while others were giggling above it. Every slight nourished your fortitude. Your ability was strained by each betrayal. Every lonely night turned into a school where you learned how to develop without approval, how to rely on your source rather than other people, and how to create stability that would withstand any storm. In reality, what seemed to be defeat was depth. You were falling in order to get back up and remain up. The same people who ignored you are now in awe of the fruit that is beginning to appear, the power, the breakthrough, the tranquility, and the confidence in your presence. Because you didn't return to exact retribution. You returned anchored, rooted, and steadfast. You turned become the very thing that keeps other people stable now. And those who attempted to bury you are coming to the realization that they planted you, not destroyed you. Now that they've seen the proof, you're maintaining, not simply surviving. The gathering is growing. Your power, your narrative, your knowledge. People are being fed, led, and inspired by it. They're coming to commemorate what they previously disregarded, not merely to apologize. They now see that you were creating legacy right under their noses while everyone else was vying for influence. The exact voice that they attempted to suppress is now what keeps others together. Many people are now standing on the land that they attempted to destroy. What they attempted to bury has grown into something holy and unstoppable, and now you are more than just a survivor. You are a root system supporting the weight of people who are just starting to realize what you endured, and they aren't just watching anymore. They're watering. Hashtag 13. You rewrote the story, but they didn't expect you to outlive it. They thought the tale would stick when they lied to you. They believed that you would adopt their identity. They portrayed you as the fraud, the failure, the villain, and the unstable person. And even those who had never met you believed it because they repeated it so often and so firmly. They were so sure you wouldn't make it through their slander campaign. They attempted to make your failure a lasting headline, not merely to ruin your reputation. However, you did something they didn't expect. You continued to live. You continued to recover. You continued to rise, not to disprove them, but to be loyal to your actual self. You refused to conform to the fictitious image they produced. You didn't waste time seeking approval or clapping back. You accomplished something far more potent. You allowed the truth to come to light by your deeds, your enthusiasm, and your calm constancy. Now that what they're seeing contradicts the story they were told, the crowd is growing. Even if you had every right to be retaliatory, they're seeing you walk with grace. They're observing your calm, non-petty movements. You returned whole, not with the intention of destroying anybody, and they're being shaken by it. Anyone may harbor resentment. Dirt may be thrown back by anybody. However, the one who changes betrayal into compassion and injustice into knowledge is someone who will never be forgotten. You become the real-life antithesis of their falsehoods. Because you're demonstrating what genuine spiritual growth looks like. Loving without losing your edge, forgiving without forgetting, and elevating without making a big deal out of it. You become the sermon that no preacher could deliver. Your life is preaching in a manner that reveals theatrical purity, phony apologies, and superficial faith. They believed they had written your conclusion. However, you completely rebuilt the story with discovery rather than retaliation. The public is now awakening to the existence of love, integrity, and divine justice in addition to your truth. Their evidence is you. Additionally, they are now listening rather than only observing. Hashtag 14. You were always just ahead. You were never alone. They misunderstood your profundity for delusion, your urgency for violence, and your clarity for conceit. People were uncomfortable with the facts you uttered, not because they were untrue, but rather because they were too genuine for their mental and spiritual states. Before the changes occurred, you sensed them. Before it was fashionable to speak out, you identified the gloom. Behind masks, you could see that many were still cheering. And they called you the issue because you didn't fit in with the crowd. The only thing you were too much of was early. And it seemed like exile, like seclusion for a time. In a world still rooted in falsehoods, you were walking with the truth. And when you are surrounded by people who are unable or unwilling to see, having that type of vision might seem like a curse. However, things are changing now. Even the things you forewarned about, the trends you identified, and the spiritual pitfalls you attempted to draw attention to are no longer hypotheses. They are experiencing them. And it's not because they just chose to like you that the audience is growing. Not because they were more sympathetic when they awoke. However, since reality finally matched with the truth you carried, they now realize that they weren't alone after seeing it firsthand and experiencing the pain of what you attempted to identify years ago. Before the map was produced, you were just following the trail. They now see your passion as discernment, even if they formerly believed it to be a weakness. They felt there was no need for your depth. However, they are now drowning in shallow waters and yearning for the things you have always held. They caught up. They didn't decide to alter their opinions. The best part is that you're not resentful. It's not something you're hanging over their heads. Even at the expense of your relationships, tranquility, and sense of belonging, you are embracing them into a reality that you have never ceased holding. To fit in, you didn't weaken yourself. The world is now at last rising to your frequency. You were turned away because you were too early, not because you were mistaken. The mob is now prepared to follow the route you took by yourself. They believed you were outnumbered, forgotten, and done. They were unaware, however, that you were never out of harmony. You were positioned, not left behind. Your roots were reinforced by the same earth that they attempted to hide. You put up with the slander, and now the evidence is everywhere. The quiet was broken by you. While they caused mayhem, you remained silent. Additionally, you rebuilt the story with God, grace, and depth, rather than only surviving it. The throng that previously turned a blind eye is now unable to ignore what is in front of them. They're rising in celebration of your return, not just watching it happen. Your life is now the proof of what divine timing, spiritual purity, and unwavering resilience really look like, not because you sought praise,